Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN AM for Thursday, June 11th, 2020. And our top stories today: fall enrollment and could colleges and universities feel a pinch, and reopening the U.S. and what that means for colleges and universities. Joining me now to discuss this and a lot more, Rick Seltzer is an editor with Inside Higher Ed. Rick, thanks so much for joining us on the program this morning.
Thanks for having me. We are hanging in there. How are you?
I'm doing great. You know, it's almost summertime. Spirits are up. The weather is nice, and I think we're doing okay. Let's jump in, because I think when we last chatted, we had just begun this pandemic, or feeling the effects of the pandemic. I think we talked in April, and now Moody's is out with a report that I think you had just reviewed, and I think you're writing a story about it potentially, that really shows the impact of the pandemic on large and small schools. What can you tell us?
Yeah, that's right. It was a couple weeks ago, Moody's came out with one report that found basically 4 in 10 of the colleges and universities whose debt Moody's rates are positioned well during this crisis. Another 1 in 10 are more heavily exposed to challenges. That 1 in 10 tends to be your places that have lower brand recognition, more regional quality, probably smaller in size. Now you'll note that 4 in 10 plus 1 in 10 only adds up to about half of the higher ed sector that Moody's rates. That last half is a little harder to quantify. They're kind of in between, could go all over the place. One other caveat to remember there: Moody's and ratings agencies generally tend to rate the stronger institutions. So this is a sample of those that are able to borrow, basically, and able to borrow in the public markets. The higher ed sector at large is probably skewed a little more heavily towards the exposed to challenges end of the spectrum than those statistics indicate, but it's still interesting visibilities. Now, if you're a bondholder, you actually probably are feeling pretty good about that report, because the institutions that issued the most debt also tended to be the ones that are set up to withstand any of the shocks we're seeing right now. Something like 70% of private university debt and 85% of public university debt was issued by that slice of institutions, that smaller slice with top debt ratings. Again, they're the ones with strong national brands. They're the ones with teams that are doing scenario planning. So again, you're feeling pretty good about this. Now, more recently, there was a Moody's report out that kind of indicated all of the different ways that things still have yet to unfold. Basically, they were looking at the potential for fall 2020 enrollment, and they said it could rise. More students could be returning to college or going to college because the economy is bad.
Rick, I think you make a really interesting point, and as I listen to it, you know, with this pandemic in general, when you look at who's been impacted the most and who's been hit hardest, a lot of minorities, women, etc., really hurt very hard. They've lost their job. They don't have money to feed their families. Really, really impactful. And what I'm hearing is that these larger institutions can weather the storm. They've got the endowments. They've got the cash reserves. They can float the bond. But these smaller and regional schools, which play a very important and critical role, and even these community colleges will play a very critical role, they could face real financial strain.
That is absolutely right. You know, in enrollment management, there is kind of a saying that a lot of the folks who work with colleges to recruit students will tell you if you get them kind of, you know, at a bar or at a restaurant and talk to them, and they'll say the places that tend to have the most trouble staying afloat financially or being strong, they also enroll the most Pell eligible students. And the Pell Grant is a federal program that's the best proxy we have for low income students. Those also this time around are the places that are really feeling a crunch, because they draw more of their money, depending on how they're set up, in some cases from room and board. They're getting more money from room and board than tuition. Well, when you send students home and the students want room and board refunds, that's a big chunk of your change. Or if they're community colleges, they're drawing a lot of money from state or local tax bases. Well, the states are widely expected to not have a lot of money next year, which we'll see how that filters down into cuts to higher education. But the general rule of thumb is most states balance their budgets by cutting higher ed in large part, because it's one of the few discretionary spending areas that they have. You can't really cut Medicare or Medicaid, excuse me. It's hard to cut pensions, but higher education has its own revenue stream in tuition, so you can kind of get by a little more with it. Unfortunately, that getting by really tends to hurt those institutions that, like you said, they're not the big endowment ones. They're not even necessarily the flagship publics that we think about, right? They're not your Ohio States, your University of Floridas. They're your two-year programs that if you don't live in their backyard, you may not have heard of, but they do a lot of important work.
Yeah, I think you're right. And there are communities that are built around these schools. That's where there are shops and retailers and barbershops and all these people that are making their living in these small towns. Last question before we go to break, Rick. Are you seeing in terms of the data that you're looking at and the team at Inside of Higher Ed that there is a fundamental transformation happening, even if it hasn't been implemented? I mean, there is going to be a shift. We're going to talk about reopening in the second segment, but there is really going to be a shift into how we do higher education.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's yet to say exactly where that shift will play out or exactly how, but there have been these pressures building on the sector for a long time. And as often happens, I think, is the pressures build. You kind of have the people who say, we see these things coming, and then it takes a flashpoint or a crisis to really tip the dominoes over, and then you find out which way, to mix my metaphors, you find out which way the chessboard's going to be set up for the next decade or for the next 5 years or whatever it is. I do think we're likely to be in one of those moments right now, just like the last recession. The 2008 recession really set the stage for a decade plus of higher education and a decade plus of the economy. Yeah,
I think you're right. This is kind of that inflection point, and no one knows. No one knows how it's going to go, as you pointed out earlier in the segment. But Rick, I'm going to hold you over. When we come back, we're going to talk to Rick about the reopening of the United States and what that means for college enrollments and higher education. So stay tuned right here on BRN AM. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms, especially for the smaller businesses? I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
The windows on our homes, they protect us and the ones we love, but they do much more. At Renewal by Andersen, making your home more comfortable is at the center of every window we make. It's why we custom build our windows in America and install them in as little as 1 day. It's why we build our frames with exclusive Fibrex composite material that's 2 times stronger than vinyl. It's why our glass helps keep your home warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and quieter all year long. It's why we stand behind every window with a 20-year limited warranty. Why not help lower your energy costs while giving your home and family the best? Call 1-800-835-6525 to schedule a free in-home consultation. Buy one, get one at 40% off with this special offer. Plus, get special financing with no money down, no monthly payments, and no interest for 1 full year. Renewal by Andersen, the better way to a better window. Call 1-800-835-6525 now.
Welcome back to BRN AM. We're talking to Rick Seltzer. He's an editor with Inside Higher Ed. Rick, thanks so much for staying with us this morning.
Of course, and thank you for giving me a promotion. I appreciate it. It won't annoy anyone on the team. They're understanding. We all we all want to elevate everyone.
Yeah, absolutely. And you guys do great work, and you are highlighting the work that the team at Higher Ed does, which is amazing. So let's jump in, because you're in the state of Maryland. You've begun a phased reopening. You're in my hometown of Baltimore, by the way, our hometown of Baltimore, and it's a phased reopening. But let's talk about what reopening at college looks like, because I guarantee you there are parents, students, professors, people that work, groundskeepers, people that work at these universities that are just wondering what's this going to look like. So what do you hearing? What are the tea leaves?
Yeah, it's been a fascinating couple of weeks or couple of months. Traffic on our articles about scenario planning spiked, and scenario planning, believe it or not, is not usually a topic that draws tremendous widespread interest. A little dry in normal times, but there are just so many variables that people are looking at that they're making anywhere from 3 to 5 to, I've heard it suggested that someone make up to 13 or 15 scenarios for the fall.
Wow.
Different things that places are looking at. Whether you can bring students back to campus. That probably starts with what the local or state health picture looks like, what officials are going to let you do. And that's not just a yes, no, they'll let us bring them back. Sometimes it's a how do we bring them back and minimize the risk. Mm-hmm. So broadly speaking, at residential institutions, the places that actually have students on campus in dorms, you're seeing, I think, a move towards single occupancy dorm rooms. Not necessarily something that is foreign, because I think over time, single occupancy dorm rooms or kind of your suite living had been going up, but a real shift to we're not going to have 2 students to a room because we don't want to have the risk of transmission there. There are obviously effects on what that means for facilities. There are effects for what that means on how many students you bring back at any one time. So there's been some really interesting activity on the academic calendars. To broadly summarize it all, a lot of places are looking at bringing only a portion of their students back. Now, maybe that means, like Stanford yesterday said, we're going to have I think it's 2/3 of our students, or we're going to shoot for 2/3 of our undergraduates to be back at any one time. If you read between the lines, they're on a quarter system, so you'll have kind of any one student will do 2 quarters on campus, 1 quarter remotely.
Sure.
And the idea being you just kind of minimize the number of people on campus. Harvard basically said most of their graduate programs are going to be online for the fall. Now, many of these places, those are 2 high profile names, right? But many of these places, there's a lot of detail once you dig into it, because how do you do a grad program that is research based, that is lab based remotely? It's pretty hard in some cases. So, some of those things probably are going to be back on campus. But you can just see how all of these things kind of cascade. And the real question is, what happens in the next few months with the health picture? If we see a continued tapering of infections, maybe these plans actually get enacted. And then you have a question about, do we test everyone who goes to campus? Do we test everyone once when they get there? Do we test everyone later? Do our faculty who are older or maybe immunocompromised, what steps do we have to take to protect them? Or are some of them even willing to do in-person classes? And then once you actually get to that point of bringing students back in August, the question is, what happens after that? Are you ready if there is a spike in local infections? Are you ready to bring students across the country? Are students willing to fly across the country? A lot of moving parts there. One other thing on the academic calendar that I just realized I forgot to mention that I would say is a very broad trend is that a lot of places are starting a week or 2 early, compacting the schedule and trying to be done by Thanksgiving. So that traditional go home for Thanksgiving, come back, and it's time to bear down and get ready for your finals, that's gone. It is, we're going to finish the in-person semester by Thanksgiving, maybe some online classes, maybe some online tests after that, but you're not coming back until the spring semester then.
Yeah, I'm also thinking about the recreation. So when I was in college, we played I played softball and hockey and, worked out at the gym. I got to think that those facilities, those situations, I mean, those are ways to blow off steam and compete and get to know your fellow classmates. Also thinking about dining. There were multiple dining facilities when I went to Hofstra, and look, we sat close together, and how are they going to serve food? You just pick it up and go. I mean, I guess that's more of an easy one, but you miss that camaraderie there.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you can talk about, and you're right, it's a lot of discussion to take out from the dining hall right now. And it's very easy to kind of make that work logistically. Well, it's not easy, but it's easier to make that work logistically than it is to kind of create all of those soft experiential parts of college that are really important. You mentioned the sense of community. You're absolutely right. There is also kind of this whole element of college that we often don't talk about these days, but traditionally it's a place where young adults go to take the next step in growing up and take the next step to kind of leaving the nest and becoming their own people. That's not just in the classroom. It's also figuring out who you are, what your interests are, what activities you're into, who your friends are, meeting new and different people, and trying to figure out how to do that is hard. Even if you figure out how to do online classroom discussions, it's just not the same experience. We'll see if any semblance of that community, any semblance of that growing up process can be figured out under these circumstances.
Yeah, and look, the kids have a lot better food, and they have access to Seamless and Grubhub and those kind of. We didn't have that when I was in college. We had to go to the dining hall, and there was a Sparrow, so we could go off campus to the diner, which I absolutely loved. But I do think that there are a lot of challenges there, and you're right. Those clubs, people that we all we kind of learn externally or outside the classroom, very important. I guess my last question is, what does this all, for you, Rick, what does this all mean in terms of tuition? We talked about the economic part in our first segment, and there is certainly going to be an impact economically, as we talked about, and we don't know what that's going to be, quite frankly. But what can you charge the same amount if you're doing a virtual class? I mean, yes, you have the same professor, but you lose a little bit of that, I think, in terms of the classroom collaboration. Is that going to have an impact on, even more of an impact on financials? Is there some pushback that you're going to get from parents who say, look, I'm not going to pay the full tuition if my kids can't be on campus and go to school? They're going to lose that interaction. There's all different learning styles. Yeah,
absolutely. And the battle lines are pretty are starting to be drawn. As with everything in life, some lawyers will swoop in and see opportunity, and there are some law firms that have really started to go after colleges. They find someone, they create a class action suit, and they say, we want a tuition refund. The argument is colleges are doing room and board refunds right now, but tuition, they're saying you're paying for the credits. You're not paying for the room and board or the on-campus experience with your tuition. We'll see where that goes, what happens in the courts there. My guess is that it will provide some downward pressure in the fall. That is largely a guess. A lot of places, or several places, have announced tuition freezes. We're seeing places take other steps to kind of try to keep the sticker price from rising, at least, which I think the market would broadly see as being out of touch.
Yeah.
But it's always hard to say long term, because higher ed is a sector that comes pretty close in some cases to perfect price discrimination, right? It's a high sticker price, high discount model. And at any one college, the wealthy students tend to pay more in net tuition than the less wealthy students. So it can be very hard to figure out what's going on until we get data on lump net tuition revenue, which takes a year or two.
Yeah, one sector of the economy that I completely left out is the bars and dance clubs, Rick. They're gonna lose out big time. Rick, always a pleasure chatting with you. Thanks so much for the update. Great seeing you as always. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you much. Same to you.
And that wraps up this episode of BRN AM. Have a topic of interest or someone you think we should talk to? Drop us a line. And don't forget, for all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance, and more, check out today's edition of The Morning Pulse. So until tomorrow, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Attention. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has officially authorized new benefits that Medicare Advantage plans may include. To get the benefits you deserve, you can call the Medicare Coverage Helpline.
Hi, I'm Joe Namath. If you're on Medicare, this is important information. I called the Medicare Coverage Helpline and they instantly looked up my coverage. In this one simple call, they offered to enroll me in a plan that includes rides to medical appointments, private home aides, doctors and nurses' visits by telephone, and even home-delivered meals. The plan also includes dental, vision, hearing, and prescription drug coverage, all at no additional cost.
Don't delay. Call to see if the new benefits are available in your area.
Call the number on your screen now. It's free.
Call 1-800-757-1451. That's 1-800-757-1451.